Okay, good morning. Today's daf is daf Lamed Bet in Chullin. We are on the last line of Lamed Aleph Amud Bet at the two dots. And we are discussing the machlokus between Rabbi Natan and the rabbis and the Rabbanan with respect to how whether or not you need intention in order to perform shchita. So Rabbi Natan says, for example, that you don't need intention. That, for example, if you throw a knife and you think that you're throwing it in order to stick it in the wall, and it comes straight across and slices the trachea and the esophagus and a majority of both of them of an animal, and so shech completes a what would otherwise be a valid shechita if you did it intentionally. The animal is shechted and it's a kosher shechita. On the other hand, the rabbis say, no, that is not a kosher shechita. You do need some level of intention. And so we had cited a situation where, from Masechet Para, about whether or not one engaged in other activities while performing the para aduma. And we saw that if you do engage in other activities while performing the para aduma, that distraction is sufficient to invalidate the para aduma. So with that as background, let's pick up with Amar Rava on the last line. So Amar Rava, Rava says, Shachat para, and Rashi tells us it's actually good to have a finger on Rashi here for this rest of this daf and for the rest of Lamed Aleph Amud Bet and then continuing on to Lamed Bet Amud Aleph. That Shachat para, what does it mean? Shachat para aduma. If you're slaughtering a para aduma, V'shachat behema acheret ima, and you slaughter another animal at the same time, and Rashi tells us v'shachat acheret ima. Chullin, we're talking about a non-paraduma animal, sheniskavinla, and you had intention to also slaughter that other animal. L'divrei hakol psula. Everybody's going to agree that in that situation, the para aduma is going to be puzzle. And Rashi continues, divrei hakol para psula machmat melacha acheret, that because of your intention to do another job while you're trying to shech the paraduma, that paraduma is going to be pasul. Ubehemak shera. And everybody would agree that in that situation, the other animal is kosher because you have the right intention. You have the intention to slaughter that other animal. You're just doing it. The problem is you're doing it at the same time you're slaughtering a paraduma, and you're not allowed to do anything else while you're slaughtering a paraduma. So that is case number one that Rava mentions. Case number two that Rava mentions. Now again, top on Lamed Bet Amud Aleph. Again, keep a finger on Rashi. Nishchata behema acheresima. If you slaughter another animal with it, and now this time Rashi says below miskavin, where you were not intending to slaughter it, and obviously we're the top Rashi on Lam Ben Amud Aleph. And again, keeping your finger in Rashi back into the Gemara, top line. Rabbi Nasan, according to Rabbi Nasan, parab sula behema kshera. When you slaughtered the other animal unintentionally, and you at the same time that you slaughtered the para aduma, then you need to the para aduma is going to be puzzle, and the other animal is going to be kosher because according to Rabbi Nosson, you don't need intention. And now that your other animal that you slaughtered is a kosher animal, you've done something else at the same time as you've done the para aduma, and that's going to be invalid. As Rashi tells us, the Rabbi Natan, top line, and Rashi on the end of the line, because your slaughtering of this unintentional animal was a valid slaughter when it comes to non-sacred animals below kavana, even without any intention. Behema ksheira, the animal will be a kosher animal and valid to eat. It's a valid shchita. Upara, and therefore the paraduma psula, the paraduma will be puzzle. V'afal gavta shalo bekavana lo amasach daite. Well, you didn't have. It's true that because there was no intention here in slaughtering the second animal, you did not have any hesech hadas. You did not have a distraction from the original intention of slaughtering the paraduma. V'lo mikrei mis asek b'malacha acheres, and we can't say that you're busy with some other job, and that's why it's going to be puzzle. Hoel v'shchitaso kshera. Um, uh, uh, but since the shchita is a valid shchita, mifsala, it's still the paraduma is still going to be invalid. Mishum v'shachat osa, because of the language in Parshas Para where it says that you have to slaughter it below osa v'chaverta, and you can't slaughter it along with another animal at the same time. Okay, and now back into the Gemara, second line, third word from the end of the line. L'Rabbanan, according to the rabbis, para kshera behema psula. According to the rabbis, the para aduma is kosher and the other animal is puzzle. And it makes total sense, as Rashi tells us, top line of the narrow lines of Rashi, Dahashchitas behemas chulin lav shchitahi, because the accidental, unintentional slaughter of the animal that was not sacred and was not going to be a sacrifice, and instead was going to even be used, and even though it was only going to be used for food, you still need to have a sufficient intention, and you didn't have that according to the rabbis. Umishum malacha leika lemifsal, and as a result, you cannot say that they were doing some other work, and so as a result, there's not going to be any psul for the para aduma itself. The shalom miskamin, when you have no intention, lo mikri osik b'malach acheres, that's not considered busy with other work. The time of the malacha acheres mishum de mesak date, that the reason, according to the rabbis, that being involved in some other work, it's not just a simply xeris hakasav, the way Rabbi Nassan would say, but rather it's about whether or not you had some thought about something else that distracted you from the underlying work that you were doing with the paraduma. Mi para who? That's the issue. It's because of mezak daite parahu. He's distracted from engagement with the paraduma. Veheka delo ichavin lemalacha acheres. But when you have no intention for doing any other job, leka hesakadas, there is no distraction. V'hachi amrinan lekaman, and this is what we're going to see shortly. Nachtecha dalas, if unintentionally you cut a gourd, ima divrei hakol kshera. When you unintentionally cut a gourd, then even Rabbi Natan would agree, because Rabbi Natan only said that the para aduma is puzzle because of his philosophy that the other animal, the chulin animal, was kosher, even though you had no special intention for slaughtering it. Well, now the Gemara asks, well, Pshita, this is all obvious. I would have known all of this based on the fact that we know Rabbi Nassan's opinion, we know the rabbi's opinion. What was the chiddush that Rabbi was telling us? This all seems pretty clear. No, nishchata behema acheres l'Rabbi Nassan itzrachela. Like it's specifically the fact that when the para aduma is slaughtered and you accidentally, unintentionally slaughter another animal with it, because that's what the chiddush is. Why is that the chiddush? Salka daitech amina. I might have thought v'shachat osa amar Rachmana, that when we said, and this was the basis, as we saw earlier in Rashi, for Rabbi Natan's opinion, that why is it that even though you had no intention to slaughter another animal, your para aduma is going to be invalid? It's because we say in the Torah, v'shachat osa, you need to slaughter with it. And here, right, this is Perek Yud Tet Pasuk Gimel in Bamidbar, so a couple parshios from now. So Amar Rachmana. So I might have thought, what does the Torah mean by that? V'lo osav v'chervata, and right, it means not it with its friend, with its fellow. So v'heki dami, maybe what is that specific case talking about? It's where you tried to slaughter, or where you accidentally slaughtered. The second animal was not a chulin animal, but rather you accidentally slaughtered a second para aduma at the same time that you slaughtered the first para aduma. Aval behema de chulin emelo. But maybe you might say that even Rabbi Natan would agree that when the other animal is a chulin animal, because it's not truly a chaverta in the context of it being fully like the original animal, maybe that is not enough to have a psul of the paraduma. So Kamash Malan, that's why we need Rava to tell us that even when there's no intention to slaughter a second animal, and that second animal, which is going to be kosher according to Rabbi Natan, is going to cause the invalidity of your intended slaughtering of the paraduma, and therefore the paraduma will not be kosher. And here we have the language that we cited a few moments ago from Rashi. As we finish up we're on Lamed Bet Amud Aleph, a few, second line above the Mishnah, second to last word on the line. Chatach dela asima, if you cut a gourd with the para aduma and you do so intentionally, divrei hakol psula. Everybody agrees that the para aduma is invalid because again, you're not allowed to do anything. You're not allowed to distract yourself from engaging with the para aduma. As soon as you do anything else, it is going to be an invalid para aduma. Nechtecha dulas ima. However, if there was no intention, as Rashi's divrei hakol kshera, then everybody would agree that both Rabbi Natan and the rabbis would agree that indeed you're talking about a kosher para aduma. And now last Rashi before the Mishnah on Lamed Bet Amud Aleph, nechtecha delat ima divrei hakol kshera, that when it says that if you again we're dealing with a situation where one is slaughtering a para aduma and now has accidentally at the exact same time that he slaughtered the para aduma, he slaughtered a gourd, not what's the word I'm looking for? A squash, right? He cut the squash at the same time. Dishalo bekavana, and now we're in Rashi. Dishalo bekavana lo mikri osik b'melacha. When you are not doing something with any intention, that is not considered doing other work, and therefore even Rabbi Natan would agree that the para aduma is kosher. The Resha. Now, what about in the first case? Because we saw a few moments ago that in the same situation where if you were trying to slaughter the para aduma, you unintentionally also slaughter a regular non chulin animal, a non-sacred animal that you now can eat. And Rabbi Natan says that slaughtering of that other animal is kosher, but the para aduma is not. Why is that a case different from this case of the cutting of the unintentional cutting of the gourd of the squash? After all, in both cases, the gourd is cut, the chulin animal is slaughtered. So why should they be treated differently? The Reisha, Rabbi Natan, Taima, the reason for Rabbi Natan that the first case of when you slaughter another animal at the same time, it's not kosher, it's because the Torah specifically says, Diksiv v'shachat ota, v'lo chaberta. You have to slaughter it alone, it meaning the paraduma alone, and not another animal at the same time. Chaberta, lo chaberta ima. V'shelo b'kavana. And even if you don't have any intention for that other animal, nami shma shchita, because Rabbi Natan says that when you slaughter an animal, even without any intention whatsoever, it's considered a valid slaughter. Remember, he's the one who says that if you throw a knife and try to stick that knife into the wall, maybe you're at an axe throwing location, if you've ever gone axe throwing, and now all of a sudden this animal happens to walk in the path of the axe, and you perfectly timed it and perfectly aimed it, and it turned out all unintentionally, and now you have a slaughtered animal in front of you. While the rabbis say that shchita is not a kosher shchita, the Rabbi Natan says, go ahead and eat that animal. So that is the situation, and so as a result, even though there was no specific alternative action that you were trying to engage in, and therefore there was no hesech hadas, the gzeris hakasav of v'shachat ota v'lo chaverta would apply, and we do not, and that animal would be the animal would be kosher, but the para aduma would not. Okay, so now we're going to have a Mishnah that talks about not waiting, not pausing in the middle of the shechita. We saw that there are 5 different invalidities for a shechita. One of them is shehiyah, pausing in the middle of it. So let's see how that plays out. Nafla hasakin behikbiyah. You were in the middle of doing shechita and the knife fell, and then you picked it up. Nafla kela v'higbiyan, or some vessel fell. And Rashi tells us, what vessel are we talking about? Rashi in the Mishnah, second Rashi on the Mishnah, kela bigadav, something of his garments. Maybe he his remember that they didn't have clothing that necessarily stayed up well if one of the ties fell. So maybe his belt broke in a modern parlance, and his pants fell down, and now he needs to pick them up. He wants to pick them up because it's kind of embarrassing, and he picks it up. And so there's a pause in his process of performing the shechita. Or hishkas es hasakin v'af, or he was sharpening the knife v'af, and he got tired as a result. As Rashi tells us, v'af nisyaga, he became weary. V'keshehizchil lishchot, and now when he began to do the slaughter, lo hayabo koach, he didn't have enough strength. Upasak shchitaso, and he pauses his shchita. Ubachavero v'shachat, and now somebody else comes in and finishes it. So back into the Gemara, ubachavero v'shachat, and so in this last case, somebody else comes in and finishes the job. So what's the story? He's now paused, and is it going to be a kosher shchita now that he's finished it? So im shaha kadei shchita, if the amount of the pause is the length it takes to perform the slaughter, psula, well then it is an invalid slaughter. The animal's not going to be kosher. Rabbi Shimon says that's not the amount of time. It's not the amount of time to perform another shchita. Rather, im shaha kadei bikor. The amount of time is the necessary time to examine, to do the examination. Now, what is it that we're going to examine? Well, it's likely going to be the knife, but we will see that at the end of the Gemara today. So, my kadei shchita. But first, we have to understand, what do we mean by the length of the time to perform the shchita? Right? There are lots of parts of the shchita. We could be talking just about the cutting. We could be talking about the setting up of the animal. We could be talking about the getting of an animal. So let's take a look and see what the Gemara says. So Amar Rav, and now again we're on the Gemara right on the top of Lamed Bet Amud Aleph. Amar Rav, right? So my kadei shchita. What does it mean by that? So Amar Rav kadei shchitas behema acheres. It's the amount of time it takes to go and slaughter another animal. Okay, so Amri le Rav Kahana Rav Asi Rav. So they Rav Kahana and Rav Asi asked Rav, Kadesh Chitas behema lebehema va'ov la'ov. Meaning, do you focus on the type of animal to determine whether the length of time? And so, as a result, when you're slaughtering a large animal, it's the time it would take to get to slaughter another large animal. And when you're slaughtering a bird, it's the amount of time it would take us to slaughter a bird. Odilma af behema la'ov. Or do we say, no, it's one standard for all kinds of animals, and even a behema, when you're slaughtering a bird, you would have the amount of time that it would take to get another larger animal in there. So, and Rashi tells us, Odilma afilu, b'kadesh 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 6 lines up in the Rashi in the narrow lines of Rashi, from the bottom of the narrow lines of Rashi, b'kadesh chitas behema mish'arinan, that the amount of the time it would take to slaughter a larger animal, that is our shear, that is the volume, that is the amount of time that it needs to take. L'shehiyas chitas ha'of, and that would apply even to the amount of waiting that would need to happen when you're even slaughtering a bird. Dahainu kula, which obviously would be a leniency because it takes more time to slaughter a large animal than it does to slaughter a bird. Indeed, if you've ever been to a chicken slaughtering house, it is quite remarkable how quickly they slaughter the birds. It's really like they're slaughtering multiple birds in 1 minute. Whereas the time it takes to slaughter a larger animal, they're not slaughtering multiple animals in 1 minute. So Amar Lahu, so Rav responded to them, Lo have bedichna be bechavivi de ishayle. I wasn't sufficiently close with my uncle when I to ask him this question. Rashi explains, what are we talking about? Lo hayita dati gasa bidodi. Wasn't comfortable enough. I didn't have enough courage on some level with my uncle, who was Rebbe Chia, kishilamadti halacha zu. When I learned this halacha, below haya besaver panim imi, and we didn't have a close enough relationship. He wasn't happy enough with me. She'ashalenu b'davar zeh, that I should ask him this question. Now, how were they related? Very interesting. Rashi points out, Rav bar achva de ubar achte de Rabbi Chia have, that actually Rabbi Chia had two half siblings who obviously were not siblings to one another that actually got married to one another. And so as a result, it was the odd situation where Rabbi Chia was actually Rav's uncle, both from his mother and his father, just not a full uncle to the extent that they were not full siblings in either case. So anyway, very interesting. Thought that was worth noting for your understanding. So we don't have an answer to that question, but Itmar, it was said about it. Maybe we do have an answer. Amar Kadesh Kiddush Behema LeBehema V'Ov La'ov. That actually, what mattered, according to Rav, meaning he doesn't have a tradition associated with it, but in his opinion, you focus on the type of animal. Shmuel Amar Afilu Behema La'ov. Whereas Shmuel says, no, it's even a large animal for a bird. V'chein ki asa Ravin Amar Rabbi Yochanan. When Ravin came, he said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, Afilu Behema La'ov. Really, even a large animal for a bird. Now, interestingly, despite the location of the Ein Mishpat Ner Mitzvahs Hey, which seems to be on Rav's statement of Kadesh Kiddush Behema LeBehema V'Ov La'ov, Rambam actually says that the halacha is like Shmuel, but only the time it would take to shecht a small animal, meaning we're going to see that actually we distinguish between a large animal and a small animal. And so when it comes to a bird, it's not the time it would take to slaughter a bull, but rather the time it would take to slaughter a goat or a smaller, an animal like that. So now we're going to get to that point in terms of the slightly different opinion. Rabbi Chanina Amar Kadeshi Yavi Behema Acheres B'Yishchot. It's not just the time it takes to do the slaughter itself. It's the time that it takes to go get another animal and to slaughter it. Whoa, that seems like a lot of time. Yavi Afilu Ma'alma. What if you have to go around the world in order to get the other animal? That seems like a lot of time. Nasata dvarecha l'shiurin. Every case will be dependent on the specific facts. Meaning, if you're in Timbuktu and you can't find another animal there to shech, well then, and you have to go, to South America, so that's going to take a lot of time. But if you're in South America, where there are lots of animals that are getting slaughtered, so then it won't take much time. So will that make a difference? That doesn't make any sense. As Rashi puts it, L'shiyurin, second line in the wide lines at the bottom, near the beginning of the line. Pamim shehi rechoka upamim kurova. Sometimes it'll be close, sometimes it'll be far. So Amarav Papa, no, it's not. That's not what we meant. Omedet lahatil ikabanayhu. What we're talking about is how long it takes to throw down the animal and put it on the ground. That's the time that we're adding, that Rabbi Chanina is adding. Amri b'Amarava, and they said in the West, in Eretz Yisrael, Mishmei de Rabbi Yossi b'Rabbi Chanina, Kadesh Yakbiena v'Yarbitzena v'Yishchot. It's talking about the time it takes to lift, the lay down, and slaughter. Meaning, if you think of a wrestling move where you pick up the person and then you put them down on the ground, that's essentially the wrestling move that needs to be done with respect to the animal to get it into the position. And so as a result, that's the amount of time that we're talking about. But the further caveat, and this is what I mentioned earlier, daka l'daka v'gasa l'gasa, meaning if you're slaughtering a large animal, well then it's the amount of time it takes to lift, lay down, and slaughter a large animal. If you're doing a small animal, it's the amount of time it takes to lift, lay down and slaughter the small animal. And therefore, when we say a bird is like an animal, we mean a bird is like a small animal from that perspective. Amarava, Rava continues, Hashochit besakin ra. Now, what happens if you slaughter with a knife that is really bad? It's a dull knife. Afilu kol hayom kulo. As long if you're going back and forth trying to do that sawing motion and you're doing it the entire day, kshera, the shchita is kosher. So by Rava asked another question that we're going to wonder why he's asking the question given this statement that he just made. Shehiyot, if you have multiple pauses, maushi tarfu, are they going to combine? So v'tivshos lamididei. Well, 1 second. You just said that if you're going to use a dull knife, you'll have all day to slaughter it. And so our assumption is nobody could go all day without pausing. And so as doesn't that indicate that there must be pauses? And as long as your pauses are short enough and not any one pause is too long, it will be okay. So doesn't that answer the question? And why did Rava ask the question in the first place when he's the one who made the earlier statement? So we answer, Hasam bidelo shah. No, exactly what we originally would have thought, that the original time of when he slaughtered with the dull knife, it's dealing with a situation where he did not pause at all. And so that's the situation. By Rav Huna braid the Rav Nasan. So Rav Huna, the son of Rav Nasan, asked, Shah b'miyut simanim. What happens if you've already slaughtered? Mahu. What's the halacha? So let's take a look at Rashi. Rashi will help us. B'miyut simanim. Explain how I know what the Gemara means. Shachad harov. If you slaughtered the majority of the veshet and the kana, the trachea and the esophagus, vishaha, and now with less than half of it remaining, less than half of each of it remaining, vishaha b'miyot ha'achron, you waited before cutting the last bit, the gomer shchitaso, and then you actually do complete the shchita. Mahu, what's the halacha? Mi amrina, Rashi continuing on the next Rashi. This is 1, 2, 3, 6 lines up in the wide lines of Rashi from the bottom of the page. Mi amrina, do we say kevan de avad le ruba it kasher? Well, he already did of the majority, and it was all kosher when he did it, so it should all be kosher. O Dilma, or maybe kevan de hadar v'gamra kula, or maybe we say no, he went back and he finished. And because he finished, it was all one action, and that action had a shahiyah in it, and a shahiyah is enough to invalidate the action, and so we take a look at the entire action, and the action's invalid. So teku, the Gemara, back into the Gemara, just at the 2 dots, the Gemara says, no answer, we cannot resolve it, and as a result, in general, we are strict on this point. Rabbi Shimon Omer, Imshah Kedei Bikor. Now, Rabbi Shimon said that it's not the amount of time to shecht the animal, it's the entire amount of time to check. And so what is it? My Kedei Bikor. What do we mean by checking? So Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Kedei Bikor Shal Chacham. It's how long it takes for a Chacham to check the knife. Well, 1 second, again, you made everything subject, very subjective, as Rashi tells us, l'shiyurin, 3rd line up near the end of the line in Rashi. Pamim dechacham rachok, upamim karov. Sometimes the chacham will be nearby, sometimes it'll be far away. And why should that change whether or not it's going to be a kosher shchita? Ela kedei bikor tabach chacham. No, what we mean is when the slaughterer, the butcher himself is a chacham. And so as a result, that's the situation where we're talking about, meaning that he himself can do the bedika of the knife. So it's not very long in the amount of time. Okay, so now we get to the next Mishnah, and the next Mishnah is going to discuss other issues with potential issues with shchita. So shachat es habeshet, ufasak es hagargeres. If in fact the shchita, he does the shchita properly for the esophagus, and ufasak es hagargeres, he tears the and Rashi tells us ufasak es hagargeres hainu ikur ubebehemakai. First of all, Rashi points out that we're talking about a large animal, not a bird. And second, he points out that this pasuk as a gergeris is what we refer to as the invalidity, the psul of ikur, of somewhat uprooting. Now, we're going to refer to this as essentially some kind of nick that happens, and so as a result, it is a tear in the trachea rather than a shchita of the trachea. And so, pasuk as hagargares, and we'll see whether these words, the achar kach, are actually supposed to be there. The Masoras Shas points out that, at least according to a variety of opinions, these words are not supposed to be there. But in any event, we'll read them at the moment. But achar kach shachas es haveshet, and then you cut with the shchita the esophagus. Shachat echad mehen behimtin la ad shemesa, or you slaughtered, you sufficiently cut either the trachea or the esophagus, but you did not cut the other one, and rather you just waited till the animal died. Oshe hechalid es hasakin takas hasheni upsako, or you did chalada by burrowing the knife underneath one of the pipes, and then you cut from the back to the front. So you cut both pipes, but you cut that instead of from the front of the neck to the back, you cut it from essentially the back of the neck to the front, but not behind. You're not cutting the spine. That would be more like Malika. But here you're not doing Malika. You're sticking. I mean, it could be that it would also be covered by this prohibition. But in any event, the point is that you burrow the knife and then you pull it out. Rabbi Yeshevav Omer Nevela. Rabbi Yeshevav says that this is a nevela. Okay, so Rabbi Akiva Omer treifa, and Rabbi Akiva says no, it's not a nevela, it's a treifa. Now this has a very important difference because a nevela, it conveys tuma. A treifa is generally considered a kosher animal, an animal that was kosher slaughtered, that we had a proper shchita, but it just had some invalidity due to it not being able to survive. And so as a result, a treifa is going to not convey any tuma. So that's a very important difference. Klal, Amar Rabbi Yeshevav, Mishum Rabbi Yoshua. So Rabbi Yeshevav taught the following general rule. Kol shenifsla b'shchitasa nevela. If the problem is with the shchita itself, then it's going to be a nevela. Kol shchitasa b'kara'ui. But when the slaughtering is done correctly, b'davar acher garam la l'pasel, and it's another thing that made the animal unfit, well then treifa. Then it's considered a treifa, and it's not going to cause tuma to be conveyed. V'hodala Rabbi Akiva. And in the end, Rabbi Akiva really recognized that Rabbi Yeshevav is correct. And so when it comes to figuring out the rule of our Mishnah is as follows. If, in fact, the shchita was done correctly and the animal is not kosher, it's going to be because of some kind of problem within the animal. So it's going to be considered a treifa, meaning that the animal will not convey tuma even as a dead animal. Whereas if when you did the shchita, one would make a mistake, and so as a result, whether it's the waiting or the burrowing or the nicking, any of these kinds of things, or the wrong angle and wrong location, that they would all result in the animal being a nevela, and as a result, it would convey tuma. Okay, but so shachat es haveshet. So our Mishnah began that if you first cut the esophagus correctly, v'hodola Rabbi Akiva, and it ended noting that Rabbi Akiva agrees with the opinion of Rabbi Yeshevav. So uraminhu. But 1 second, let's take a look at another Mishnah, because the next Mishnah, or I'm sorry, not the next Mishnah, but a Mishnah on Mem Bet Amud Aleph is going to teach the following: Elu treifas habevehema. Here are the animals that would be considered a treifa, or the issues that would be considered a treifa. And one of them is nikubas haveshet upsukas hagargeres. If you have an esophagus that has a hole in it or a trachea that has a hole in it. And so as a result, aren't these, isn't that exactly our case? And yet it's called a treifa, not a nevela. And even Rabbi Akiva ends up agreeing here that it's a nevela and not a treifa. So what's the difference between these two mishnayos? And if you're gonna say, well, I don't understand. Here you're in the middle of engaging in the shechita itself. And so, isn't that different from the other situation where it seems to be that the animal just had a punctured esophagus or a cut trachea? And the answer to that is, well, at that Mishnah does not seem to distinguish how those things happened. And so, as a result, our Hava Mina is that it doesn't make a difference how they happen, even if they were to happen during the course of Shechita. It's if the animal has a punctured esophagus or a severed trachea, that is going to cause the animal to be only a treifa, because that's the first words of that Mishnah, and not a nevela, which is where we come out in our Mishnah if these things happened as a result of the process of shchita. So we're going to offer three different answers to this question. The first answer will work, but it will require us to effectively reread the Mishnah on Membet Amud Aleph. The second answer will not work, and the third and final answer will work, and will make everything work together. So let's take a look. Amar Rava lo kasha. That's not a problem. Kan sheshachat ulbasov pasak. Kan shepasak ulbasov shachat. The question is the order. If you're doing shchita and then in the end you end up at the end of the shchita and you tear the trachea, well then that's our Mishnah, and so as a result that would be a situation where it's going to be considered a nevela. But Kan, the Mishnah on Membet Amud Aleph, shepasak ulvasov shachat, where you initially cut the trachea, or the trachea was already cut, and the esophagus was cut, and then you shecht the esophagus, or you shecht the trachea, meaning you had a problem with the first one, and then you did the second one. Fine. So as a result, it began as a treifa before you did the shchita, and so therefore, when you do the shchita, it's going to continue to be a treifa, and that's what the second Mishnah is talking about. Shachat lebasof pasak nifselas b'shchita. So as a result, if you slaughter and then you tear the you do some tearing, well then it's a problem with the shchita, and therefore it's a nevela. Pasak b'lobasov shachat. But if it was torn and then you did shchita, ki davar acher garamla lipasel damya. It's as if we treat it like the animal was unfit before the shchita, and now you did a proper shchita, and so as a result, that's why in the other case it's going to be a treifa and not a nevela. So Esvei Rav Na'acha bar Huna l'Rava, when second Rav Acha bar Huna points out, hey, that doesn't really work very well, because what does our Mishnah say? Shachad es a veshet, ufasak es a gargeres. If you slaughter the veshet, and then, if you do the proper shchita of the esophagus, and then you tear the trachea, so that's going to be, that's the case of our Mishnah. Or, pasak es gargeres, or if you tore the trachea, shachad es haveshet. And then, and again, the words here of the achakach can either come out according to some opinions, or we could keep them in. But the bottom line is that here we're talking about, it's clearly the other order. In both of those cases, it's a nevela. So how can you say that our Mishnah is talking about where you did the pasak first and then the shchita, and I'm sorry, you did the you do the pasak first and then the shchita, and not the other way around. It clearly applies in both directions. So ema shachat as a veshes mikara. No, so say what we mean is that in both cases we're talking about, even in the second case where it says pasak as a gargeres, the shachat as a veshet, we mean no, you shechted the veshet first and then you did and then you tore the gargeret. So both cases are really the same. So Amar Lei. So Rav Agabar Huna says, that's your answer to me, Rabba? Shtei shuvos bedavar. I can respond to you in two things. Chada dahainu kamaisa. First of all, you have your Mishnah, our Mishnah telling us two cases of the same exact case in a row. Again, both cases would involve tearing the trachea after cutting the esophagus. And so as a result, that's why it's going to be, that's why our Mishnah is going to be a nevela. But v'od ha Tanya v'akakach. And moreover, this Mishnah specifically, there's a brisa that specifically says that the language of v'akakach is there. And again, the same, the Ramban and the Rashba changed the Tanan to Tanya in order to make all of this consistent. Again, you can read it as Tanan, the way it's written, and understand that this is pointing out that even the Mishnah is not consistent with Rava, but that seems like an odd thing for Rava to have missed. But Ela Amar Rava, so as a result, Rava says no. Elu Asuros Katani. Don't say that Elu Trefos, on Membedam and Aleph, but rather say that these are animals that have various kinds of prohibitions. B'yesh mehen nevelos, b'yesh mehen treifos. And there are some that are going to be a nevela and some that are going to be a treifa. And so as a result, the first two cases in our Mishnah, in that Mishnah, are examples of our Mishnah. And so as a result, that everything is consistent. V'lekshav nami dechizkiya. And once we've done that, we can also, so now the question is, why not also say in the Mishnah in Membenim and Aleph, the case of Chizkiya? What is the case of Chizkiya? Damar Chizkiya, asa gistra nevela. If you cut an animal smack in half, it immediately becomes a nevela. And the why would you think that it would not be? Of course, it's going to die. But the point is even as it is moving around while still, looking possibly like it's still alive, it's still considered immediately dead, and therefore can convey tuma as a nevela immediately. So why not list that case in the Mishnah on Mem Bedam and Aleph? Now, if that Mishnah was only talking about trephos, well, of course, that's not going to be a trefa, and therefore that's why it wouldn't be listed. But here now you're saying that it's listing even nevela cases. Let's list that case. And moreover, the likshav nami to Rabbi Elazar, we could even also list Rabbi Elazar's case. Dam Rabbi Elazar, as we saw a few weeks ago, I think at this point, nitla yarech, if you cut away at the thigh of an animal, so you cut off a leg, the chalal shala nevela, and you can see the cavity of the body of the animal, well, then that's considered a nevela immediately, even though the animal looks like and is acting as if it's still alive. And so as a result, let's list that case in the Mishnah on Membet Amud Aleph. And so why don't we do that? So Rava answers, no, kikatani nevela, when we're talking about nevela cases, we're not talking about the lo mitam michayim. We're talking about cases where it's not still quote unquote alive and conveying tuma, meaning it's not as soon as those things happen that they convey tuma, rather, and therefore it's only cases where the animal is rather completely dead. Aval nevela de mitama mechayim lo katani. The cases where it's a nevela even when and causes tuma, even when it's alive and moving around, those are not the cases that we are learning in the Mishnah on Membet Amud Aleph. And so as a result, we end up with the following effective answer, number one, to our question, which is, hey, Our Mishnah says that these cases are cases of nevela when you do the shchita, and either you nick it at the beginning or you nick it at the end. And we have a Mishnah on Mem Bet Amud Aleph that says that those cases seem to be treifas. And so we answer, no, don't understand that that Mishnah is talking only about treifas. Rather, that Mishnah is talking about various kind of things that are prussel, and it includes nevela as well. And don't ask me about those cases of a cut in half animal or an animal whose leg has been severed, because those are cases where the animal is conveys tuma even while it's still moving around. And we're talking about cases of where nevela cases only where the animal is fully dead for it to be a nevela. And so as a result, now we've gotten everything to go nicely together, even though we've had to change some language over there on Mem Bet Amud Aleph. Okay, so that was answer number one. Answer number two, Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish says no. Here we're dealing with a situation where you did the cut in the same place where there was the problem. And over there in Mem Bet Amud Aleph, it's talking about where you do the shechita, not at the location where there's the issue. And so as a result, because you cut it in the place where there's a problem, it's going to be a nevela. But if you cut it in a place where it's not going to be a problem, so as a result, the shechita is sort of like a really good shechita, well, then it's going to be a treifa. So shachar b'makom chatach nifsla b'shchitahi. When you slaughter it in a new place, it's considered when you slaughter it in the same place, it's considered a problem with the shechita. Shelo b'makom chatak. But if you slaughter it not in that same place, ki davar acher garam la lipasel domya. It's like a situation where the animal became unfit for another reason. And so that's our situation. And that all works. Umiyama Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish haki. But 1 second. Could Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish have really given this answer? Because Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish himself says, Shachar esakana, if you slaughter successfully the trachea, v'achar nikva hareya, and then you puncture the lung. Now, of course, the lung gets the air from the trachea. And so as a result, and a puncture in the lung would constitute a problem with the shchita, with the animal, and cause it to be a treifa. And yet, in that situation, kshera, it is a kosher shchita, assuming that you do a fully valid shchita as part of the entire process. Why is it a kosher shchita? Alma, we see, keman de mancha b'dikula damya. It's as if you put the trachea into a basket, meaning that you, Rashi tells us, Alma, this is now Rashi 3, 6, 9, 12, 15, 17 lines down in Rashi, end of the word line in Rashi. Alma, Kavan de Re'ia Tuluya Bakana, because the lungs are dependent on the trachea. Vinishkat Hakana, and you successfully did shchita of the trachea. Havi Kamosha Nitla Kula. It's as if the whole thing was removed. Min HaBehema, out of the animal. Umunechas Basal, and you put it into a basket. V'sulo mitrifa, and so as a result, there's no possible treifa here. But v'sulo mitrifa behema, and so as a result, there can't be a treifa in this animal as a result of it. The gabi pasakul b'sof shachad. Well, now when you have a case where you cut the trachea and then you did the shchita. So, and we say, and let's take a look at the little aleph, shelo b'makom chatach, and we're dealing with a situation where you cut it not at the location of the tear in the trachea. Nami kevan deruba nifsika, because you've already torn a majority of the trachea. Daha pesukat hagargeret, which is that's what we're talking about, the breaking of the trachea, beruba, with the majority of it. Who? Haviala kemancha bedikula. It's as if you put that trachea into the basket. V'shuv ein lebehema zu b'shat shchita ela simin achad. It's as if the animal only has one simin. And so as a result, it is impossible to do shchita, a valid full shchita on that animal any longer, because uba eina yotza midei nevela. And so as a result, it should never leave the category of nevela. That's the question. And yet, according to Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish's proposed answer, he was saying that if you do the shchita not in the place of where the prior cut was, it should be considered a treifa and not a nevela. So hakinami commandum and hakinami commandum mancha bedikula damya. He should be considered as if he put it the trachea in the basket, and therefore it should be a nevela, not a treifa. And we don't answer this question, and as a result, Reish Lakish's approach is effectively rejected. So Ella Amarabichia.
Where did he cut it? He cut the trachea in two separate places.
We're dealing with a situation according
he
to
cut it once, he nicked it, then he cut it somewhere else
and then he cut it somewhere else. Correct. That was his proposed answer to. So our Mishnah is dealing where he cut it he nicked the trachea, and then he does the shchita in that same location. So as a result, that it's not a fully valid shchita, and his proposed answer for Membet Amid Aleph is he nicked the trachea, and then he did a valid shchita somewhere else along the trachea. And so but the problem is that according to Reish Lakish, once you have something either done or done wrong, it seems like he ignores that item. And so as a result, he should ignore, once you've nicked the trachea, or not just nicked, but cut a majority of it, so it's going to create a problem. So once you've gotten that yourself into a problem, you can't it's as if the trachea is no longer in the animal. And so as a result, it's not possible to do a valid shchita any longer, and therefore this cannot be a consistent statement of Reish Lakish, and therefore we're going to reject that answer, and we need to come on to a third and final answer, and with that we will conclude.
Well, does that become a treifa then, according to him?
No. According to him, it's a nevela because you don't have a kosher shchita. The only time you end up with a treifa is when you have an animal that is puzzle for another reason, and now you did a valid shchita of it. But here, because the nick already happened, and so as a result, as part of your slaughtering, and so as a result, that nick made it into it makes we ignore the trachea now from the purposes of doing shchita, because you can no longer do shchita on the trachea. It's as if you're doing shchita of just one pipe, and one pipe is not a valid shchita, and therefore the animal is going to be a nevela. And so that is.
But we've normally considered nevela as an animal found dead on the street. So we're saying this person creates a nevela. He creates a nevela.
Absolutely, you can most definitely create a nevela. If you go to an animal and shoot it in his head, you've created a nevela. There are lots of ways that you can create a nevela, of course, and certainly if you do shchita improperly, that's what we're teaching now. That's the lesson of our Mishnah. Our Mishnah's lesson is if you do shchita improperly, you've created a nevela. You have not created a treifa. So Ela Rabbi Yochanan bar Abba Rabbi Yochanan. So we get the third and final answer from Rabbi Chia bar Abba in the name of Rabbi Yochanan. Lo kasha kan kodam chazara kan la'achar chazara. No, you're misunderstanding. The whole point is that when the Mishnah over there on Mem Bet Amud Aleph is before Rabbi Akiva retracted his opinion here. And here, it's after. Here, obviously, we note his retraction. Mishnah lo zaza mimikoma, but we didn't move the place. Meaning, the Mishnah on Bet Amud Aleph had Rabbi Akiva's opinion from before he retracted it. And yes, he retracted his opinion, but we still taught the Mishnah on Mem Bet Amud Aleph with his opinion, even though he ended up changing it. And so the bottom line is, on some level, this actually ends up being relatively similar to our first answer, because in both cases, it turns out that the Mishnah on Mem Bet Amud Aleph is actually dealing with nevela and treifa cases, and not just treifa cases, despite its wording to the otherwise. Okay, and so with that, we will pick up with a further analysis of Reish Lakish's statement, God willing, tomorrow. Looking forward.
And yet the Mishnah is Membet appears later on, and the retraction is before that Mishnah even occurs, right?
No, that's a very, thank you for highlighting. What the key lesson that we're trying to teach here is that the order of the Mishnayos is not necessarily the order in which they were taught. that in fact the Mishnah here has aspects of it that were taught after the Mishnah on Mem Bet Amud Aleph, namely the retraction by Rabbi Akiva. That retraction is noted here, even though it happened after the Mishnah on Mem Bet Amud Aleph was taught. But they didn't want to move because that's the right location for that Mishnah. And so as a result, that's how they ordered it. It's important to note the fact that the ordering of the Mishnayos does not necessarily reflect the ordering in which things are taught. And so that is effectively it often will, and we'll sometimes use it, but we can sometimes say, as we're saying right now, that the Mishnah, a later Mishnah, was actually taught before our Mishnah, and the retraction that is referenced in our Mishnah is not reflected in the later Mishnah.
Yeah.
Okay. Looking forward to continuing our learning together. Have a wonderful day.